Just 20 years ago, it would have been impossible to imagine legal marijuana in the United States. Now, Colorado and Washington state, they've legalized it for recreational use. In nearly half of the states allow medicinal marijuana, and it looks like the tide is turning. More states are seemingly following suit. I want to bring in Andrew now with both the why and where it goes from here.
And Richard, a short time ago, I spoke with author Bruce Barcot. He wrote the book, Weed the People, The Future of Legal Marijuana in America. I asked Barcot whether the country has passed a tipping point when it comes to legal marijuana. Bruce, in your book, Weed the People, you not only look at the changing mores and morals surrounding marijuana legalization, you also spend time with the people involved in that evolving industry. I'm curious, do you think we've passed a tipping point here? Is legal recreational marijuana now a matter of when and not if? And do you think it'll happen everywhere?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I think a year ago when I was still researching the book, I thought it would be a real possibility that the next president, whoever he or she might be, could come in and end this experiment with legal marijuana on in their first week in office. But now, I think we have actually reached a sort of tipping point, and that tipping point has been essentially the experience we've seen in Colorado and in Washington State. I live here in Washington State, and I can tell you that a lot of the fears that people had about legalizing marijuana have not come to pass. I think it will continue to be, to come into legal status on a state-by-state basis. I don't see some grand, piece of legislation rolling through Congress. It's hard to get anything through Congress these days, let alone something as controversial as marijuana.
Having experienced legal recreational marijuana in Washington, what's the biggest danger 1 year in?
It's interesting. I think the biggest danger or the biggest challenge so far has been in the area of edibles. I think that a lot of people who are either coming back to marijuana or are trying it for the first time, who are over 21, tend to buy edible products, whether it's a piece of candy or a brownie or a liquid, because they're not that comfortable with smoking. But the problem is that nobody really knows, if you haven't used this stuff, how edibles affect your body. There's often a time lag between when you eat it and when the effects kick in. So what has evolved is essentially this advice of go low and go slow and start to learn what things like milligrams means. I mean, essentially, if you're an adult trying this for the first time in a legal state, you should try it at about 5 milligrams, which is, affects a lot of people like having a beer or a glass of wine.
Mm-hmm. Bruce, you were a skeptic, a self-described skeptic, before you voted for legal recreational marijuana in Washington State. You certainly don't seem like a skeptic anymore. You don't read like one in the book. What changed your mind before the vote?
Well, it's interesting. When we were faced with a vote here in Washington State in November of 2012, I really was leaning against passing marijuana. It was not something I was into. It's not my drug. I had 2 young teenagers. I had concerns about them gaining more access to it. I eventually basically held my nose and voted yes. A friend of mine convinced me. She said, look, this is not a vote about whether you like or don't like marijuana. She said, nobody really cares whether you like marijuana. She said, this is a civil rights issue. It's a social justice issue. We have way too many people, and especially people of color, who are sitting in jails and prisons over marijuana. And she's argued that it was a substance really no more dangerous than alcohol. I was a little skeptical about that, but I voted yes. And the next day, found that we had in fact passed legal marijuana. I wondered, what in the world did we just do? So I spent the next 2 years trying to follow up and answer that question, going in really with a skeptical eye and taking a look at both the history and the science of marijuana. And then following the rollout here in Washington and in Colorado and seeing how it's gone. And honestly, from a skeptic's point of view, I have to say it's gone extremely well. I'm pretty firmly now in the camp that says we really should both legalize and regulate marijuana. It's not enough to legalize. There's got to be some good, strong regulations in effect for this whole thing to work.
So, Bruce, what's the biggest unfounded fear among skeptics and critics who say no to legalization and no to even medical?
I think the biggest unfounded fear is that, somehow an epidemic of stonerism will break out in your state if you move to legalize and regulate marijuana, that the roads will be filled with stone drivers, that people will show up, in a blurry haze at work every day. And honestly, that's absolutely not the case. We have a lot of high-tech companies that are thriving here in Seattle, Amazon and Microsoft and others. And that's really the biggest unfounded fear. I think the other fear that's a legitimate fear is the fear that it's going to find its way into the hands of young people, of teenagers and folks who are under 21. So far, that hasn't happened here in Washington State. We're keeping a sharp eye on it. I've got 2 kids in middle school and high school, and I keep my ear to the ground and check in on local crime statistics. So that really hasn't happened so far. Those are the 2 main big fears, and as I say, so far they really haven't come to pass.
And finally, and quickly, Bruce, you spent a lot of time in the book talking with users and also the business people involved in legal marijuana. What were the biggest surprises that you took from both the users and the people involved in the marijuana business?
I think the biggest surprise was how quickly marijuana goes from this taboo, alluring, mysterious substance into simply a crop. The first time I walked into a legal marijuana grow, I was sort of blown away visually and by the smell of the plant. And the third or fourth time I walked into one, and it was like walking into a cornfield. Honestly, it just becomes another crop, another plant. The other surprise is that it can be hard to sell. Opening a legal marijuana shop is not like printing money. It becomes a retail product. It's a competitive business, and you can lose money selling pot, as hard as it is to believe.
Well, it sounds like any other industry in that regard. Bruce Barcot, the author of Weed the People, The Future of Legal Marijuana in America. Bruce, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
So Rich, a cynic, a critic of legalized marijuana, says he came around and he actually supports it across the country now.
It's going to be interesting how this plays out. We want to get you, the audience, involved in this. Head over to Facebook and Twitter and join our conversation. Here's our question. Do you think marijuana should be completely legalized across the country for recreational purposes? We'll get to some of those comments coming up tomorrow night. But coming up next, we have Hudson Valley Headlines, so stay with us.